Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where in the world and which time zone you're joining us from. Welcome to the second public lecture / seminar of 2021 held here, there, at the Azrieli Institute of Israel. This is, of course, our first event in the month of February. There is more to come. Let me tease you about those details later on today. It is my privilege and really utmost pleasure to bring to you an eminent scholar of Jewish and Israeli diplomacy, international relations, all the way from Israel, Professor Emmanuel Navon, who is going to be sharing with us the history of Israeli and Jewish diplomacy based on his findings and arguments in his hot off the press, recently published new book, The Star and the Scepter. Before turning the floor or the computer screen over to Professor Navon, please allow me to read out a few details from Professor Navon's very rich intellectual profile and biography. Professor Navon is an international relations expert who teaches at Tel Aviv University and the HERZL Interdisciplinary Center. He's a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, which is a foreign policy think tank, and the Kohelet Policy Forum, which is a public policy think tank. He's also a senior analyst for I-21 News, which many of you know. It's an Israel-based international TV channel. Professor Navon has been described as a new voice from Israel because of his sharp writing, public speaking, and TV interviews. Professor Navon has authored 4 books already and dozens of articles that have appeared in prestigious journals such as the Review of International Studies and the Israel Journal for Foreign Affairs. And also, he wrote a number of articles in world-class newspapers such as Le Monde or Newsweek. He is a sought-after public speaker. He has addressed the American Enterprise Institute, APEC, the Jewish Federations of North America, as well as leading universities such as Georgetown, Columbia, and Rice, and now Concordia. Professor Navon is a frequent guest for American, French, and Israeli media, and he has appeared on Voice America, on France 24, as well as on the Knesset channel. Previously, Professor Navon served as head of the Political Science and Communications Department at the Jerusalem Haredi College. He is founding partner of the Navon Levy Group, which is a consultancy that promoted Israeli agricultural and energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa. He is CEO of BNIC, which is an NGO that trained Israeli business leaders in diplomatic advocacy. He is also a consultant with Arctic, a leading European consulting firm that specializes in research and development funding. Professor Navon was born in Paris, France in 1971. He went to a bilingual French and English school. He graduated in public administration from Sciences Po, which is one of the most prestigious and eminent universities of the continent. In 1993, he moved to Israel, where he enrolled in the IDF. He earned a PhD in international relations from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's equally comfortable, fluent, and eloquent in English, French, Hebrew. He's also conversant in German and Italian. He lives in Israel with his wife and their 4 children. And today, he graciously agreed to share some of his precious time with us on the computer screen. Professor Navon, Emmanuel, if I may, the floor and the computer screen are now yours.
Thank you very much, Csaba. It's really an honor to be here. I see some familiar faces. I mean, not familiar faces, but I see that in the audience, a reviewer of my book, Brandon Mullen. Nice to see you. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. So as Csaba said, I'm going to be talking tonight. Tonight in Israel, this afternoon in Montreal, about my new book, The Star and the Scepter, a diplomatic history of Israel. We have about 35 minutes to cover 3,000 years of history. So try to stay awake. If you fall asleep for 2 minutes, you'll miss at least 200 years of history. So I'll try to, it's quite a challenge, but I'll try to do this anyway. As Csaba said, it's a new book that just came out with the Jewish Publication Society and the University Press of Nebraska. The reason why I decided to write this book is because I've been teaching a class on Israel's foreign policy for many years at Tel Aviv University and at the IDC HERZL, and I came to realize that there was no book, no comprehensive book on Israel's foreign policy. So I decided to undertake this project, but then when I started writing the book and working on it, I asked myself, well, yeah, but the problem is, why start in 948? Obviously, the modern state of Israel was founded in 948, but Jewish history didn't start in 948. And therefore, in my opinion, if you want to write a comprehensive diplomatic history of Israel, it has to go back to antiquity, the ancient kingdoms of Israel, in order to provide a wide historical perspective. I admit that this is very ambitious, but I decided to undertake this project regardless. Why did I call the book The Star and the Scepter? It's inspired from a verse from the book of Numbers, where it says, "A star rises from Jacob, a scepter comes forth from Israel." One of the curses turned blessings of the prophet Bilam on the Jewish people. And in my opinion, and this is also the central thesis of the book, what characterizes the diplomatic history of the Jewish people since ancient times is a constant tension between political realism on the one hand and a religious faith and a feeling of historical mission on the other. I claim that this feeling of historical mission or religious faith is symbolized by the Star of David, and that political realism and power are symbolized by the scepter. Now, you'll notice that the name Israel, or Israel in Hebrew, was given to Jacob in the Bible after his nightly encounter with the angel, pictured here on this PowerPoint by Rembrandt. And after this struggle, this physical struggle, Jacob is given the name Israel. And the meaning of the name is fighter of God. And the angel tells to Jacob, now that you've proven your willingness and ability to fight in the real world, your new name is Israel. Before that, Jacob was described in the Bible as a man of the tents, as an intellectual, and his twin brother Esau as a man of physical strength with no spirituality. And neither was capable of inheriting the historical mission of their father and grandfather. And it's only when Jacob proves his ability and willingness to use force in the real world that he received the name Israel. And yet, this change of name is not definite in the Bible. You'll notice that other biblical figures, when the names is changed, this is definite. When Sarai becomes Sarah or Avram becomes Abraham, it is final. In the case of Jacob, on the other hand, the biblical text keeps going back and forth between the two names. And I claim that the reason for that is that, in a way, the Jewish people never fully internalized the need to combine between spirituality and physical strength in the real world. I think this idea is also expressed, and I quote him also at the beginning of my book, by Cardinal Richelieu, who during the 30 Years' War in the Holy Roman Empire, being a cardinal of the Catholic Church, should have supported the Catholics, but instead supported the Protestants in order to make the German Empire bleed and make France the strongest power of the continent. And in order to justify himself, he came up with this formula: man is immortal, his salvation is in the world to come. The state has no world to come, its salvation is now or never. Or in other words, the concept of raison d'etat, or Realpolitik in German. So as I said, and I quote here, forgive me for quoting myself, in the book, the central idea or thesis emerges from this historical survey: the Jews have survived and succeeded in their interactions with other nations thanks to a strong sense of historical mission, as well as to the constant adaptation of that mission to the real world. The book is divided in 4 parts: Israel and the nation, and the nations, in the Hebrew Bible, Jewish diplomacy from antiquity to modernity, the rebirth of Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Israel on the world scene. For today's presentation, what I'd like to do is very, very briefly touching upon one aspect of each of those topics, or each of those parts in the book. Let me start with the topic of Israel and the nations in the Hebrew Bible. I thought it was necessary to look at the topic of Israel and the nations in the Hebrew Bible in order to understand how Jews perceive themselves in the world vis-a-vis other nations. And here I'd like to point out to 4 topics in this part of the book. One is the encounter between Jacob and his brother Esau when he receives his name Israel, as I explained before. There are 2 different views among commentators in the Jewish tradition about how Jacob debased himself towards Esau and called himself your servant, and called Esau my masters. Some commentators claim that, for example, the Midrash and Nachmanides condemn Jacob's submissiveness to Esau and his use of the expression "my Lord" and "thy servant." On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi says that Jacob was right and that Jerusalem would not have been destroyed had the Jews been more respectful of the Roman Empire. So here again, you see this tension between assertiveness and submissiveness, or political realism and faithfulness to your identity. I also claim that in the book, for example, of Jeremiah and the prophets in general, I think if we want to understand the historical survival of the Jewish people, it is also because the Bible, and especially the prophets, developed this unique eschatology that basically described the drawbacks and defeats of the Jewish people, not as a defeat of their faith and not as an end of their history, but as a deserved punishment for misbehavior that would be followed by redemption. And it is precisely because the Jews never perceived their defeats in history as the end of history, but only as a necessary punishment for the misbehavior to be followed by redemption, that in my opinion, that in a way also explains the survival, the historical survival of the Jewish people. I also claim that if you look at the Hebrew Bible, you can see two types of Jewish diplomacy in the diaspora. Here again, I like, as you notice, I like Rembrandt, what I call the hard power in the book of Esther, the ruthless use of political power to overcome enemies, and on the other hand, the soft power of Daniel in the book of Daniel, using example and relying on miracles. 2 completely different approaches of Jewish diplomacy in the diaspora. And the last point regarding the topic of Israel and the Bible, Israel and the nations in the Hebrew Bible, is the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the return to Zion. I think it's pretty amazing when you read those 2 books today, the book of Ezra, and you see how the biggest empire on earth at the time, the leader of that empire, Cyrus, allows the Jews to return to the land and build a temple, but the new inhabitants of the land oppose the reconstruction of the temple and use diplomacy to try and convince the empire not to let the Jews rebuild their temple. And you see this diplomacy, this Jewish diplomacy at the time, trying to overcome the resistance of the local population and the resistance also of the biggest empire on earth, walking back from its commitment. And in many ways, sometimes you feel like you're reading the diplomatic struggle in the 20th century between the Zionist movement and the British Empire. Sometimes it seems very similar, and I think it's important to have this historical perspective. The historical perspective in the book continues with the topic of Jewish diplomacy from antiquity to modernity. As I said, my book tries to provide a wide historical perspective. So I have a few chapters dealing with diplomacy in the ancient kingdoms of Israel, but also during the diaspora. And here again, I claim that we keep seeing this tension between faithfulness to your history and identity on the one hand, and political realism on the other hand, with two examples that I bring here: the rebellions against foreign empires, under the rebellion against the Greeks, which was in fact successful and led to the establishment of the Hasmonean kingdom, which expanded its borders and came to be recognized as such by the Greeks. On the other hand, the rebellion of Bar Kokhba against the Roman Empire was a disaster because it completely overlooked the actual political and military power of the Romans. And here again, commentators, ancient Jewish commentators are divided as to whether or not Bar Kokhba was crazy or whether or not he did the right thing. But we keep seeing again this tension between political realism and faithfulness to your identity and history. And then again, throughout Jewish history, during the diaspora, I claim that there was a Jewish diplomacy. Just one example, the fact that the case for Jewish immigration to England was made by a Jewish scholar and diplomat, Menashe ben Israel, a Portuguese Jewish scholar who traveled to England and met with Cromwell in 1655 and convinced him to reopen the British Isles to Jewish immigration. This was Jewish diplomacy. Same thing in modern times. I mentioned, for example, in my book, the Damascus affair in 1840. Here, the Jews of Damascus are wrongly accused of a blood libel, and we see powerful Jews around the world, I mean, in Europe, in England, and in France, Moses Montefiore, James de Rothschild, Adolphe Crémieux in France. And here you really have, probably for the first time in modern times, what I call a Jewish diplomacy of major Jewish figures with political and economic powers using their influence to basically force the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to walk back from this false accusation, and having European powers basically convince the Ottomans to abandon this blood libel against the Jews. And of course, with the establishment in 1897 of the Zionist Congress by Theodor Herzl, the same moment the members of the Zionist Congress became diplomats. Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, the moment they joined the Zionist movement, they became Jewish diplomats, and they tried to gather the support of the world power for the Zionist movement and Zionist project. And I think that here again, very quickly, the Zionist movement had to face this dilemma between realism on the one hand and faithfulness to your vision on the other. The first test of this dilemma, I think, was the Uganda Plan in 1903, where the British Empire, which did not rule yet the Middle East at the time, of course, could not help the Zionist movement because the area was run by the was dominated by the Ottoman Empire. And as we know, in 1903, the Secretary of the Colonies of the British Empire offered Uganda to the Zionist movement. Herzl brought the proposal to the Zionist Congress not because he liked the idea, but because there was an emergency due to the pogroms in Russia. And the debate at the Zionist Congress was a very heated one between those who wanted a realistic solution here and now to face the issue of the pogroms in Russia, and those who remained faithful to the Jewish ideal of return to Zion. Same thing with the partition plan proposed by the Peel Commission in 1937. Again, a dilemma between political realism and faithfulness to your past. Take what is available here and now, or remain faithful to your plan. Here again, as we see on the map here on the right, the Peel Commission had suggested to establish a Jewish state on a very small area in the north of Israel, of British Palestine at the time, and the coastal plain, in what you see here in beige, and in purple an Arab state, and in green the maintaining of British rule. A very tough debate within the Zionist leadership in British Palestine. Again, the emergency here was that the Nazis had been in power already for 4 years in Germany, and there was a need for a Jewish state that would enable free Jewish immigration, but it was a tiny area that did not even include Jerusalem. A very tough debate within the leadership of British Palestine. Eventually, David Ben-Gurion accepted the principle of partition, but with a very heavy heart. The third part of the book, as I said, the rebirth of Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Here I want to touch upon one aspect of this topic, which is the periphery strategy, which I think is relevant today also to understand the normalization between Israel and the Gulf states. The concept of this periphery strategy was born in the late 1950s, when in the mid-50s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had taken the distance from Israel. The Eisenhower administration in the United States wanted to force on Israel some kind of territorial compromise with Egypt and with Jordan in order to reach a peace agreement. You see here the map of the Alpha Plan, which was a compromise between the partition plan of the UN in 1947 and the armistice lines agreed at the Rhodes Agreement in 1949. So the West Bank was supposed to get bigger, and also in the South, as you see, the Americans and the British wanted to create some kind of territorial continuity between Egypt and Jordan. This was rejected, and yet, with the Suez Crisis in 1956, Israel and its French allies aroused the ire of the United States, because the United States did not want to be perceived in the Arab world as being supportive of Israel, and therefore Eisenhower went out of his way to condemn Israel's invasion of the Sinai Peninsula with the support of the French and the British, even though at the same time, in the same year, he didn't do anything to condemn the Soviet invasion of Budapest. And then, as Israel's only ally at the time, France, Israel had one ally at the time, which was the French Fourth Republic, but then de Gaulle came back to power in 1958, and he started undoing the military relationship between Israel and France. And that same very year, 1958, a United Arab Republic was established between Egypt and Syria. The United States was not interested in any kind of alliance with Israel, and therefore our Prime Minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, came up with the idea of a periphery together with the head of the Mossad, EZRA, which was to say that Israel was isolated internationally. It was opposed by the Soviet Union. The United States was not interested in an alliance, and France was already started to drift away. So the idea was to establish alliances in the region based on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, especially with Iran, with Turkey, and with Ethiopia. The Iranian regime was in favor of the Shah of Iran, even though there was, of course, a contradiction in that policy, because this periphery strategy included not only states, but also minorities in the region, such as the Kurds, but also the Christians in Lebanon and in South Sudan. With Iran, we became really allies after the opening of the Straits in 1956. Iran became Israel's first main provider of oil. There were direct flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran. And especially after 1958, when Iraq became a pro-Soviet regime, this strengthened even more the relationship between Iran and Israel. This relationship basically ended with the revolution of 1979, even though it continued behind the scenes because of the war between Iran and Iraq. Israel's relation with Iran, in fact, continued in the early 80s, something that was revealed by the Iran-Contra scandal in 1985. But of course, with the nuclear program of the Iranians, which was restarted after the end of the war with Iraq in 1988, and of course, with the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994, which was ordered by the Iranian regime, Israel and Iran became enemies, especially when in Iran today is building this ring of pro-Iranian Shia regimes around the Middle East. With regard to Turkey, our relation with Turkey, our special relation with Turkey, was based on a few common interests and enemies. The common enemy was Syria, because of the water dispute between Turkey and Syria, also because Turkey had annexed the Alexandretta province, which you see here on the left, from French Syria in 1939. So there was a territorial conflict between Syria and Turkey, also a conflict about the Kurds in eastern Turkey, which were supported by the Syrian regime. For all those reasons, Israel and Turkey had a special relationship, a relationship that became even stronger with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, because at the time Turkey was a secular republic that felt threatened by the Iranian expansionism, and even more so with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of all those Muslim republics in the Caucasus and Central Asia, where Turkey feared the influence of Iran, and therefore the Turks upgraded their relation with Israel by establishing full diplomatic relations in 1992 and signing an agreement on joint military exercise in 1996. One of the reasons why the Turks also wanted this relation with Israel was to block the recognition of the Armenian genocide by Congress. And you see here on this map the countries that have recognized the Armenian genocide, but at the time the US did not, because AIPAC used its influence as part of the deal with Turkey. It's no longer the case, with Turkey under Erdogan having turned into an Islamic regime allied with the Iranians and with Hamas, which again has turned Turkey into a regional, I wouldn't say enemy, but a challenge for Israel. And this becomes clear also in the Eastern Mediterranean, where you have this partnership today between Israel, Greece, Cyprus, against Turkey. I mean, Turkey is trying to build its own natural gas pipes with Libya. And today you have this confrontation between Israel and Turkey in the Middle East, when in the past you had a partnership, also because Turkey supports all the most radical forces in the Middle East. So we've lost Turkey, but the periphery is still relevant. It's even turned upside down, because today the irony is that in the late 50s and early 60s, Israel built a periphery, a strategy of the periphery with Turkey, with Iran, and with Ethiopia against the Arab world. And today it's the very opposite. Today we have an alliance with the Sunni states of Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Bahrain, Oman, and even Sudan against Turkey and against Iran, and also with Azerbaijan, which recently raised many criticism because of our support for the Azerbaijan regime and its war with Armenia. So the periphery is still relevant today. It's just been turned upside down. The last topic I want to very briefly mention is the fourth part of the book, and I'll end with this, Israel on the world scene. Here, I'd like to talk about energy. Energy is very much part of Israel's foreign policy. Originally and historically, energy was always the Achilles heel of Israel's foreign policy. One of the reasons why President Roosevelt opposed the partition of Palestine and an independent Jewish state is because he thought that this would alienate the Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia. One of his last meetings before he died was with King Saud of Saudi Arabia, which created a de facto alliance between the United States and the Saudi monarchy around the supply of oil and the security of Saudi Arabia. The oil lobby in the United States was very much opposed to the independence of Israel. A close advisor to Roosevelt said that if had he been alive in 1947, Israel would never have been established. And then, of course, fast forward in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo, this again proves how much Israel was sensitive to the use of the oil weapon by the Arab world against Israel. So as I said, historically, the energy was always the weak point of Israel's foreign policy. And that was true also because oil is concentrated geographically in certain areas in the world, as you can see on this map on the left, and also because OPEC, which was established in the 60s, created a cartel among which major Arab and Muslim countries were members, and this is how they used this huge power they had in 1973 to try to isolate Israel internationally, which worked because indeed this oil embargo did very much hurt Israel's international standing after the Yom Kippur War of 1973. But then, historically, things started to change. Of course, if you look at the historical prices of oil, they went up dramatically after the Yom Kippur War and after the revolution in Iran in 1979. But if you look in recent years, the trend is the opposite trend. The prices of oil have been going down. One of the main reasons is the shale boom in the United States, which has turned America recently into the largest producer of oil in the world. And because the amount of oil on the market has increased dramatically, the prices of oil have gone down. And if you look today, the biggest, as I said, the biggest producer of oil today is the United States. Before Russia and before Saudi Arabia, the United States today is no longer dependent on the Middle East for its oil supplies. And this very much weakens the ability of oil countries in the Middle East to use the oil weapon as a geopolitical weapon. Also, the decline of the price of oil has also weakened oil countries. If you look at the map on the left, the graph on the left, you see the fiscal break-even oil price for countries such as Iran, Algeria, Oman, Saudi Arabia. That's where they need the prices of oil to be to have a balanced budget. That's why they have a huge budget deficit, because the prices of oil today, they need the price of oil to be around $100. Today, it's about $30 a barrel. And this is why, as you can see on the graph on the right, most oil countries today have a budget deficit. And that's why many economists talk about a post-oil economy. On the other hand, natural gas is becoming the energy of the future with very high demand. And here, of course, Israel has a huge advantage because Israel has become a natural gas exporter, which has created a partnership recently with Cyprus, Greece, Italy, and the European Union, the establishment in January 2019 of the EastMed Natural Gas Forum, which also includes Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, the fact that the prices of gas have going down because of America, again, also because of the shale revolution, America having become a huge producer of natural gas, this also explained a lot about the geopolitics of the Middle East and also about the JCPOA. Why did Russia and China and other countries want to sign the JCPOA? Because as you can see on the graph on the right, the United States today is the biggest producer of natural gas, but Russia, Iran, and Qatar together hold about 2/3 of the world's proven resource of natural gas. And this is why Russia, for many years, has been trying to build a cartel similar to OPEC for natural gas. And this also explains the bad blood between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. So as you can see, energy also explains a lot about the politics of the Middle East. And as I said, it also explains why today you have this tension between, for example, Israel and Turkey in the East Mediterranean, with France and with the president of Egypt trying to stop the influence of Turkey and of Erdogan in the region. This regional confrontation today in the East Med between Israel, the European Union, and Egypt on the one hand, and Turkey on the other hand, is also partially explained by the geopolitics of energy. I'll end here, as I said, many topics, and I'll left enough time for your questions, but I'll just like to end forgive me for quoting the book again, the end of the book, where after this very wide survey of Jewish and Israeli diplomatic history, I come to the conclusion at the end of the book that, as I said, it was by combining an unwavering faithfulness to the past. If I forget thee, Jerusalem, my right hand forget me, the Jews had sworn throughout the centuries, with a pragmatic adaptability to the present. Built more, schmilt more within a Jewish state, said Ben-Gurion prior to the statehood that Israel prevailed in 1948. So thank you very much for your attention. And as I said, I left enough time for questions and comments and discussion.
Emmanuel, thank you very much for this sweeping tour de force of Jewish history, Jewish/Israeli diplomatic history that you have covered all the way from Chumash, from the beginning up to yesterday. This was remarkable, and all of this in 35 minutes.
35 minutes.
And you even have the humility to apologize. So please don't. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Let me ask members of the audience to please start sending your questions, if you will, through the chat. I already have one that came in earlier by email, so let me start with that.
Okay.
And I will keep monitoring the chat just to give you an opportunity not to have to do that, Emmanuel. And if I see that multiple questions might overlap, I may decide to skip some of them over, for which I in advance apologize to the questioner. So the first question comes from Dr. Rachel Blumenthal, who is joining us from Tel Aviv also this evening. And her question is about Israel as the spokesman for world Jewry. Do you think that the state or diaspora organizations should represent the transnational community in global politics, for instance, in matters of claims for restitution of property that was plundered from Jews during the Second World War, or expropriated from Jews when they were when they were expelled from the Arab countries after 1948? So Jewish diplomacy recast in a different context.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I have a chapter in the book on Israel and the Jewish diaspora, because the complicated relation between the modern state of Israel and the Jewish diaspora is very much part of Israel's diplomacy today. And of course, from day one, if you read Israel's Declaration of Independence, the declaration calls upon the Jews of the diaspora to join Israel in the effort to rebuild the country and to come to Israel. And as soon as Israel became independent, very shortly after its independence, it passed the law of return, which basically turned every Jew in the world into a potential citizen of the state of Israel. And this created many frictions, not only with countries that were opposed to Jewish immigration to Israel, especially the Soviet Union, but also for different reasons, France, for example, because the moment the Zionist Congress was established, basically it denied the idea which had been prevalent in Europe since the end of the 18th century, that the Jews were no longer a people, but only a religion. And by establishing the Zionist Congress, the Zionist movement said, no, we are still a people. And this kind of brought an elephant in the room, especially of Western Jews who didn't want to be reminded that they were still a people. They didn't want to hear that, especially in Western Europe, in the United States. And very, very early, there were frictions, not only between countries that were opposed to Jewish immigration, but also with Jewish communities in the West that denied Israel's right or claim to speak in their name, saying we're Americans, we're French, we sympathize with Israel's independence, but please do not talk for us, do not embarrass us. We're not Israelis, and obviously when it comes to claims, for example, this was also in the early days of Israel's independence, the fact that Israel, the government of Israel, negotiated with West Germany a reparation agreement which was signed in 1951. But I mean, you ask about the reparation. He also created a huge debate and a very tough dilemma in Israeli politics about whether or not to agree to this agreement with West Germany. Ben-Gurion basically, here again, going back to my theme of political realism versus principles or ideals and realpolitik. You know, in diplomacy, you always have this tension between political realism and principles or ideals. And it's true even more so of Israel, which has a strong sense of historical mission, and on the other hand, faces a very tough reality. So the reparation agreement with Germany was also a very typical example of political realism versus principles. When Ben-Gurion said, we need this agreement because, you know, we need the money. The Israeli economy needs the money. And the opposition leader at the time, Menachem Begin, said, no, it's immoral to sign an agreement with West Germany. So Begin was talking more about principles. Ben-Gurion was talking more about realism. It seems to me that, you know, when you happen to be in power, it's easier to be an idealist when you're in a position than when you're in power. In fact, I even heard it from the son of Menachem Begin himself. I was very surprised when he said to me, yeah, it was easy for my father to be so opposed to the agreement because he was in opposition. So as I said, you know, it's easier to be an idealist when you're in opposition. But here was a very clear example of this tension between political realism and principles.
Thank you very much, Manuel. The next two questions, let me take them as a bundle and let me allow you to decide which one you want to answer first. So the first one is from Mr. Mark Spires, and this is about the lack of an Israeli written constitution and its implications. So Israel doesn't have a written constitution. Why do you think this is still the case, and what are its implications, I guess, for the subject that you're studying and that you presented? And the second question is from the reviewer of your work, whom you introduced earlier, Mr. Brandon Marlon, joining us from Ottawa there this early afternoon. And his question is as follows: has the subject of Torah, religion, and foreign policy been sufficiently dealt with in scholarship and writing? So are there other scholars, for example, Professor Michael Breacher from McGill University, who would have applied this framework to study Israeli and Jewish foreign policy? What's the relationship, if you will, between in-depth scholarly analysis of the prescriptive theory as opposed to descriptive history of Jews' relations and Jewry's relations with other nations, broadly speaking?
Thank you. So regarding the first question, the Constitution, as you know, we do not have a written Constitution for many reasons. Ben-Gurion originally said, you know, we need more Jews to be in Israel to proclaim a constitution. Some claims that the true reason was that he was not interested in a constitution because the purpose of the constitution is to be a check and balance on the executive power. And, you know, it's very convenient when you don't have a written constitution to do whatever you want, which was probably his real intention. There was also an opposition from the Orthodox parties at the time, the religious parties. That was the very idea of a secular constitution. So it was decided to push it off at the time. And like many things that you push off in Israel for a couple of years, we're still there after 70 years. So instead of a written constitution, we have fundamental laws, which, by the way, I mean, in Germany, the Grundgesetz is also it's a fundamental law. I mean, it doesn't exactly have the status of a constitution, so it's called Grundgesetz. It's a fundamental law. So we have all this kind of fundamental laws, which have some kind of constitutional status. We have a basic law, I mean, a fundamental law, basic law on the Knesset, on the government, on the president, on human dignity. And basically, if you take all those basic laws together, they constitute the equivalent of a constitution, which is something that was never really meant completely by the legislator. I mean, just calling a law a basic law, it's only in the early 90s that the Supreme Court ruled that those basic laws together constitute the equivalent of a constitution, right? Which is also why you had this controversy 2 years ago when Israel passed its basic law on the nation state, because the nation state basic law basically is the equivalent of a preamble in most European constitutions, describing the identity of the state, its political symbols, national anthem, etc., etc. But there was a debate in Israel about whether or not this basic law sufficiently mentioned the principle of civic equality. So we still have a constitutional debate in Israel of whether or not the basic laws together constitute a constitution or not. But, and I'll finish with that, this debate is still not over because the fact that the Supreme Court in its ruling in 1995, in the ruling called Bank Mizrahi, basically said that part of judicial review in Israel is that the Supreme Court or the High Court of Justice is entitled to strike down regular laws that are not consistent with basic laws. It was called at the time the Constitutional Revolution, right? And now, and this has been for the past 25 years, this has been the legal doctrine of the court, that it can strike down regular laws that it deems incompatible with basic laws. Now, 2 years ago, as I said, the Knesset passed a new basic law called nation-state law, and this has been also challenged in court, and the court has been asked to strike down this basic law. Now, the problem is that the court itself for the past 25 years said that it can only strike down regular law that are not consistent in its view with basic laws. And the court did not throw out the case about striking down the basic law on nation state. And some legal scholars in Israel say, well, yeah, it should also strike down this basic law because basically we don't like it. So that would be a second constitutional revolution. But as you see, that the debate in Israel, this constitutional debate in Israel, is a very hotly debated issue, whether or not at the end of the day the Supreme Court should have the last word when it comes to judicial review. I think that saying that the court itself should be entitled to strike down basic laws would turn the separation of powers with a hierarchy of power, and I think that this would be a dangerous precedent. But that's my own opinion. Just to bring it back to the topic of Israel's foreign policy, I'll just give you one other example of how the court used to be much more cautious and much less activist after Israel and Germany established diplomatic relations in 1965. The ambassador sent by the German government was a former officer in the Wehrmacht, and so some citizens of German origin in Israel petitioned the court, asking the court not to let the government receive the credentials of this ambassador who was a former Wehrmacht officer. And guess what the court answered? The court said, yes, I understand that you guys are very upset, but it's none of my business. This is not a legal issue. Today, the court would never say that. Today the court would say, well, yeah, you sure? I mean, this kind of self-restraint of the court saying, well, I understand you, but this is none of my business. It's not a legal issue. This is no longer the court in Israel today. Anything goes. As the former Chief Justice Aaron Barak said, everything is justiciable. So you can bring me anything, I'll deal with this. There's no such constraint today as there was in the past. Regarding the question of on theory and Michael Breacher, if you look at the book of Michael Breacher, The Foreign Policy System of Israel, which was published, I think, in 1972, 1973, I mean, the reason why there's no theory in my book is basically because I can't stand that field known as international relation theory. So I'm not going to write a book and give myself a headache. Besides the fact that, as I said to Csaba before, I got the second jab of the Pfizer vaccine yesterday. I do have a headache right now, but I'm not going to make it worse by writing a book on theory because I'm just not interested in that topic. That's why I didn't write about theory, because I don't find it interesting. And I think that the book of Michael Breacher, I mean, it's a huge effort, but it barely deals with Israel's foreign policy. It's all about theory, theory, theory. I mean, that's not the book I wrote. I wrote about history.
And on that note, if I may just maybe nuance Brendan's question a little bit further, how unique would you say your approach that combines Jewish religious history with a very keen understanding of foreign policy analysis? So how unique are you in terms of bringing Torah and foreign policy together?
Well, the reason why I wrote 3 chapters on the topic of Israel and the nation, the Hebrew Bible, is because I think there's something unique about the Jewish people, and you cannot understand Israel's foreign policy today, in my opinion, and the way the Jews see themselves vis-a-vis other nations, without understanding the founding document, which basically shaped and still influenced the Jewish mentality, regardless of whether Jews are religious or secular. But I'm saying the concept just as a people that dwells alone, all these concepts cannot be understood without biblical knowledge. And that's why I thought it was important to look at how Jews perceive themselves historically. And that's why I looked into this topic of Israel and the nations in the Hebrew Bible. And as I said, one of the one of the particularities of the Jewish people is that the Jews are altogether a people, a nation, and a religion. And that is pretty unique. I mean, there are other nations in the world with a particular religious allegiance. The Shinto religion is a Japanese religion. The head of state in England is also head of the Anglican Church, and the Poles are mostly Catholic. But still, in the case of the Jews, it's different, because the Jews are altogether a religion and a people. And when I mentioned this also at the beginning of my book, when Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, described the Jews as a fossil, is because he couldn't make sense of Jewish history, and starting with the name Israel. I mean, that's why as I said, what is the meaning of the name Israel? Where do you find it in the Bible? And what is the meaning of that name? It's a name that is given at a specific moment when a patriarch, the patriarch Jacob, with his historical mission, can only receive the name Israel when he, as I said, when he shows his willingness to fight in the real world. And that's why I think that not only can you not study and understand Israel's foreign policy if you only start in 1948, you need a wider historical perspective, which is what I did. But it's also, as I said, that you need some basic biblical knowledge to understand the Jews and the way they perceive themselves in the world, in my opinion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emmanuel. Emmanuel, let me take the next couple of questions also together. And then with that, I will perhaps ask members of the audience to think about sending in more questions if they have, because that probably will be the last round that we would take to make sure that we don't put undue burden on you, especially after the second vaccine shot, as you said, Emmanuel. So there's a question from Eleanor Bonder about the rights of liberal Jews. So the question goes as follows, and maybe let me just nuance it a little bit further, but then you, of course, can take it in every which direction you would like, Emmanuel. So Eleanor's question is, so what do you think about the rights of liberal Jews, including the rights of women in Israel to pray with the Torah at the wall, at the Western Wall? You, of course, might want to discuss it in the context of who should speak for these rights, Israel, global Jewry, or located between submission and assertiveness. There is much to say. It's, of course, completely up to you. And then a question that brings together Miriam Cohen and Miriam Tarder. They both would like to ask the same question about the accord, the first Abraham Accord, if you will, between the UAE and Israel. Do you think this really needed President Trump? Was he really essential to broker this alliance? Or do you think that based on what you have told us, the realism and the necessity of the day and the time would have brought together, would have catapulted, if you will, and incentivized the UAE to seek out the connection with Israel? And there is a comment from Ms. Lillian Weinberg, Ms. Lillian Weinberg-Goodman, who is telling you that she is very much looking forward to reading the book. It is a thick one, Lillian, but it's worth every page. So, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much. So first of all, regarding the first question, historically, I mean, I mentioned before the complicated relation between Israel and the diaspora, especially the US diaspora. and I quote in the book statements from Jewish leaders in the early 50s telling David Ben-Gurion, we're not Israelis, we're American. Don't tell us, to make Aliyah. America is our country, etc., etc. So this tension is not new. This tension between, liberal Jews in America and Israel, and of course, because in Israel, the Orthodox rabbinate has a monopoly of the questions of state and religion, even though there's no official state religion in Israel. Judaism is not an official religion. The relation between state and religion in Israel is very ambiguous, as opposed to what you have in for example, in Denmark or in England. There's no official religion in Israel. But on the other hand, all matters of personal life, such as marriage and burial, is handled by religious courts, whether you're Muslim, Jewish, or Christian. When it comes to the Western Wall, but not only the Western Wall, also the recognition or non-recognition of non-Orthodox conversions, for example. This is a bone of contention between Israel and the American diaspora, because Israel's Orthodox rabbinate does not recognize non-Orthodox conversions. And also when it comes to the Western Wall, the law in Israel says that you have to respect the custom of religious sites. Doesn't matter if they're Muslim, Jewish, or Christian. When you go to the old city, according to Israeli law, you have to respect the custom of the site you visit. That's the law. Now, the Orthodox rabbinate claims that the custom at the Western Wall is to have prayers according to the Orthodox tradition. And that's why they claim that whoever prays at the Western Wall not according to the Orthodox tradition violates Israeli law by not respecting what they see as the tradition of the custom of that place. Which is why you see those very disturbing images every so often of policemen basically trying to stop women who want to read a Sefer Torah in the women's section or wear tefillin at the Western Wall. I think that the compromise which had been reached regarding in 2017 of having a separate plaza at the Western Wall for non-Orthodox prayer was a good one. Unfortunately, the Israeli government decided to walk away from it because of political pressure and politics. The Orthodox parties in the coalition did not want to honor this agreement with American Jewish organizations, and I very much regret it. I was very critical of the Israeli government when it walked away from the agreement which had been reached with the major Jewish organization in America, both regarding the Western Wall and the extra plaza for non-Orthodox prayer, but also regarding the recognition of non-Orthodox conversions. Here again, you see the influence of domestic politics on our foreign relations, and including our relation with the Jewish diaspora. Another last point on this is that there's a big mentality gap, I would say, between Israelis and American Jews, because most Israelis, even when they're secular, they don't really care about the monopoly of the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate at the Western Wall. They see if you look at the polls, most Israelis, even when they're secular, tend to see the woman of the wall, for example, as a needless provocation. And on the other hand, on the other side of the Atlantic, many modern Orthodox rabbis are in favor of the woman of the wall. I mean, not many, but some of them. They see this as a principle, precisely because they're American, as a principle of freedom of faith and freedom of expression. So you have much more understanding, I would say, for the woman of the wall from modern open Orthodoxy rabbis in America than from certain secular Israelis who don't really care about it. So that's also, I mentioned this because it's also, we have to understand this mentality difference, I would say, between Israelis and American Jews. But as I said, I very much believe that we should come back to the compromise which had been reached between 2017 regarding the Western Wall and the recognition of non-Orthodox conversions. Regarding the Abraham Accords, could it have happened without Trump? I think that he definitely put a lot of pressure for these to happen. But the underlying causes were there. And the underlying causes are that, of course, the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia are very fearful of Iran and see in Israel their most reliable ally in the region against Iran's imperialism. But it's also something that I mentioned during my presentation, the post-oil economy. The fact that those countries can no longer rely on oil for their long-term income. And they know, whether it's the UAE, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Bahrain, that precisely because of the long-term tendency of the decline of the prices of oil, I mean, you see the budget deficit of Saudi Arabia. It has like a 15% budget deficit pre-corona. They know that their future depends on technology, that today, in 2021, the most successful economies in the world today are those that have added value when it comes to technology. And that's why they also see in Israel a partner for their economic future. Prince bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is trying to wean the Saudi economy from oil. And, in the Middle East, when you say technology, you say Israel. So they need Israel not only to face Iran, but also to diversify their economies, to wean themselves away from oil. And therefore, the conditions for rapprochement were there. The fact that President Trump decided to push it is due to many reasons, but I think that it's a welcome move, and it needs to be, I think, preserved and pushed forward by the new administration.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And the last two questions. The second last one is from Don Serged, and Don's question is as follows: based on your analysis of recent and older history, how do you see the issue of the Iranian threat? What, if anything, can we learn from the recent appointments that the recently elected new president of the United States, President Biden, has been making to his cabinet? And the last question is again from Mr. Mark Spires, who would like to ask you to comment on the recent and very frequent Israeli elections, and what do you think, why do you think they are happening, and what impact do you think this electoral uncertainty is having on the West Bank in particular? Of course, if you want to open it up on Israel-Palestinian relations, you can take it in every which way you'd like. The general question about the causes and consequences of the current electoral and political instability that Israel is facing.
So regarding the question of Iran, definitely I think that here also, if you want to understand how Israelis perceive Iran today and the Iranian threat, beside the objective data that we have on where the Iranian nuclear program is standing, also about Iran's missile program, its support for the Shia militia throughout the Middle East, but also in Africa and in South America. These are objective facts, but then next to that, you also have perception, how Israelis perceive the rhetoric coming from Iran. And here, again, it's something that you cannot understand without having a wide historical perspective on Jewish history. This feeling of existential threat. I think the fact that, some Israeli leaders evoke very often the Holocaust, the threat of total destruction. I think this also is something, the way the Israelis perceive the Iranian threat is something that is impossible, in my opinion, to understand without understanding Jewish history and how it has influenced the way Jews perceive those existential threats, which, by the way, sometimes might make it maybe more difficult for Israelis to handle diplomacy when it comes to Iran, because I think that, I believe that everybody understands the concept of deterrence. It doesn't matter if you're a Shia Muslim republic or a communist country. I think that both the both the Iranian mullahs and the dictator of North Korea understand the concept of deterrence very well. When you're threatened by another country, or when you threaten a country that itself has a nuclear arsenal, I think it concentrates the mind of anybody. So it might be that Israelis sometimes are kind of overtaken by their historical memories and perception because of our history. And maybe sometimes it even undermines our ability to handle the Iranian threat in a more rational way. That might be, but I'm leaving this for further debate. Regarding Israeli elections, well, in a nutshell, those endless elections, 4 elections within 2 years, you'll notice that this is the first time in our history that we've had those endless elections. So when people say, oh, it's because of Israel's electoral system, it's simply not true, because since 1949, we've never had this phenomenon. It's recent. So we haven't changed our voting system. The only change we've had is that we've increased the threshold, the electoral threshold, from 1 to 2% and then 3.25%. So obviously this is not due to our voting system. We have proportional representation, like most countries in Europe. It's not because of our voting system. It has to do simply to the fact that there is, for the past 2 years, we've had a paradox in Israeli politics, where there is on the one hand a majority for the right, but not for its leader. Because Netanyahu has made too many enemies within the right, and therefore he doesn't have a majority. But he doesn't want to leave power for many reasons, some of them being related to his lawsuit. And therefore he's holding the country hostage of his willingness, of his determination to stay in power. So this will keep going on until nobody is able to replace him. We'll see. I think this time, in the upcoming election, this time we are very likely to see a change, because it is the first time he's being challenged from the right. And this time, in the past 3 elections, he has not been able to have a majority. We'll see. But this time, the upcoming election is different from the previous ones, in the sense that this time he's being challenged from the right, and I think that hopefully we'll have a stable government that will last 4 years, and that will put an end to this maddening, endless elections in a time of a pandemic. It's unbelievable. With regard to decision making and the future of the region, again, that's for sure that this political instability makes it very difficult to implement policy, not only regarding the conflict with the Palestinians, but all issues. The fact that Israel doesn't have a budget, that we're still working on the budget of 2018, is something that is unacceptable. And the question was also about the West Bank, if I'm not mistaken, about how they would impact on the Palestinians. So again, I mean, first of all, Mahmoud Abbas declared that there was going to be an election in the Palestinian Authority, but again, he's declared this many times in the past. Most people don't take this seriously. When it comes to the Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think that the Biden administration is definitely not going to waste precious political capital on this right now. They're going to focus on the Iranian issue. From my talks with senior advisors in the Biden administration foreign policy, they have very low expectation from this issue. What they do expect, however, is for Israel to come up with practical ideas to improve the daily lives of the Palestinians, but they've learned from the mistakes of the past, and they don't plan to come up with some kind of as John Kerry did in 2014. They said, you guys have 9 months to solve this conflict. This is not going to be the policy of the current administration.
Emmanuel, there's one last question that I'm going to just sneak in. And if you want to answer it on one foot, if you still have the strength, please do. If not, we'll blame the second portion of the vaccine. from Ms. Lillian Weinberg-Goodman. In your opinion, is there anyone credible and or capable to replace Bibi?
Well, I'm biased on this because I myself, I'm actively supporting a candidate. So I'm not, I cannot, I have to admit that I'm not objective. My answer is not objective. First of all, I support Gideon Saar, and I think he's a very good candidate. But I think that the very fact that, people have gotten used to this idea that only one man can be prime minister in this country is insane. I mean, it's completely insane that we've gotten used to the idea that only Netanyahu can be prime minister. Why? Like, there are 9 million people, there are 9 million citizens in Israel. He's been prime minister for 15 years, and he wants another 4 years. It's unheard of. The record has been so far in Germany was Helmut Kohl, and now soon to be shared by Angela Merkel. But even then, it's too long. I mean, how long can you be prime minister in a democratic country or president? This is completely ridiculous. Beside the fact that I think he's completely overrated. I mean, he's done many good things for Israel, but he's definitely not as amazing as he thinks he is. He talks a lot and does very little. But I think the very fact that we've gotten used to the idea that only he can do it just shows how successful he has been to basically brainwash us by taking control of most of the media in Israel. We just have to put an end to this and move forward, have a new leadership, thank him for the very good things he's done, especially in foreign policy, and realize that in a democracy, it's just not normal for somebody to stay so long. And by the way, we've seen an example of this today when the prime minister is in the middle of a court case. He was in court this morning. It took him all morning. And one of the reasons why the cabinet could not decide on reopening the schools tomorrow is because the prime minister was busy handling his court case all morning. I mean, this is insane. It has to end.
Emmanuel, thank you. Thank you for regaining your strength and answering this very challenging, very important question. But above all, thank you so much for taking us on this wonderful intellectual journey. As I said earlier, starting back with Tanakh and bringing us up to date until what happened this morning in the District Court of Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a virtual round of applause, if you will, to thank Professor Navon for joining us this evening, this early mid-afternoon in Montreal, all the way from Tel Aviv. And we certainly look forward to you joining us again at our next Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies public event. The next one is coming up, as you see on the slide, just a week from today on February 15th, when we will be teased to the fascinating history and present of Israeli innovation, talking about the important findings from his recent book, Thou Shalt Innovate. I would like to close by thanking Ms. Jennifer Solomon, who has been in contact with many of you by email and who is always making sure that the events are working so seamlessly on our computer screens, as well as I would like to extend a thank you to Lisa Komlos, our former student, currently coordinator of our social media affairs, who has been in contact with many of you via Facebook and Instagram to make sure that we were able to meet here today. So Jennifer, Lisa, thank you very much. Emmanuel, Professor Navon, we look forward to welcoming you back, either on the screen or perhaps in person in Montreal.
Hopefully in person in Montreal.
Or in Montreal and then in Israel, on whichever side of the Atlantic. Emmanuel, thank you
very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us again a week from today. And if you want, if you care to take note of where you can order Emmanuel's book, please do so. We'll be very happy to provide you with that information also later on by email. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.